At roughly 1500 hours on April 18, 1943, the sky over Cape Bon, Tunisia, was deceptively calm. The Mediterranean reflected the late afternoon light as if nothing unusual were about to happen. Yet within minutes, the airspace over that narrow stretch of water would witness one of the most unbalanced aerial engagements of the entire Second World War. What unfolded became known to American pilots as the Palm Sunday Massacre, a name chosen not for symbolism, but for the sheer scale of destruction inflicted on the German transport fleet in an astonishingly short period of time. The exact number of aircraft lost by the Luftwaffe remains the subject of debate. German documentation lists 24 U-52 transports destroyed and 35 others damaged, while U.S. airmen claimed anywhere from 50 to more than 70 kills. Although the numerical disagreement persists, historians generally agree that the psychological impact outweighed the statistical uncertainty. In barely a quarter of an hour, the U.S. Army Air Forces demonstrated a level of control in the air that directly challenged the confidence of German planners, who had long dismissed the possibility that American aviators could reach such a level of tactical mastery. The confrontation involved a striking imbalance in force composition. The Allies deployed 47 P-40 Warhawks, supported by 12 British RAF Spitfires, against a German formation of 65 Junkers U-52 transports, guarded by approximately 15 Bf-109 fighters and 4 to 5 Bf-110s. The result bordered on annihilation for the German group. At least 24 transports were confirmed destroyed, while 9 Bf-109s and 1 Bf-110 were also shot down. The Allied losses amounted to 6 P-40s and a single Spitfire, underscoring an extraordinary kill ratio. To the Germans involved, the events of that late afternoon seemed to erupt out of nowhere. What they could not have known was that for weeks, Allied forces had been reading their communications thanks to Ultra, the British code-breaking initiative centered at Bletchley Park. In effect, every schedule, route, and escort plan for the supply flights into Tunisia had been compromised. American squadrons were not merely patrolling, they were waiting for specific formations at specific moments, having trained extensively to intercept the slow-moving trimotors. By mid-April 1943, the broader strategic situation in North Africa was deteriorating rapidly for the Axis. The remnants of the Africa Corps, alongside Italian units, found themselves pressed tightly between the British 8th Army advancing from Libya and U.S. forces driving from Algeria. Roughly 250,000 German and Italian troops relied almost entirely on airborne resupply. With the sea lanes turning into a death trap due to Allied operations centered on Malta, aerial transport became the last sustainable option. To sever this remaining lifeline, the Allies had launched Operation Flax on April 5, 1943. Unlike earlier sporadic interceptions, Flax represented a coordinated, intelligence-driven interdiction effort. Ultra provided daily, sometimes hourly insight into Luftwaffe logistics, allowing Allied air units to position themselves directly in the path of the transport corridors between Sicily and Tunisia. The workhorse of these supply missions was the Junkers U-52, a rugged trimotor aircraft that had served Germany from the Spanish Civil War onward. By 1943, many of these transports were flying several round trips per day, carrying ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to the Tunisian bridgehead and returning with the wounded or specialized personnel. Although heavily used, the aircraft were considered reliable, and German air crews believed that low-altitude tactics, often skimming only 50 feet above the sea surface, would keep them hidden from radar and reduce exposure to enemy fighters. Complementing these tactics were fighter escorts drawn from experienced units such as JG-27 and JG-53, and the Luftwaffe also varied mission timing to avoid predictable patterns. Under normal circumstances, these precautions might have provided at least partial protection, but precision planning is futile when the adversary already knows your departure times, flight paths, and escort strength. And so, on April 18th, as a large formation of German transports began its return flight to Sicily after delivering supplies to Tunisia, Allied fighters, guided by intelligence and prepared through practice, moved into position. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but the sudden collapse of a carefully organized airborne lifeline, struck down in minutes by forces that the German command had underestimated for far too long. The German air group consisted of 65 U-52 transport aircraft flying in compact, mutually protective formations. Their escort came from seasoned pilots of II-JG-27 and detachments of JG-53, men hardened by the long North African campaign, many of whom had accumulated impressive victory counts over the desert. Yet the defenders carried a vulnerability that no amount of experience could offset: fuel endurance. Operating at the far edge of their reach, the Bf-109s had no more than 20 to 30 minutes of fighting time once they reached the Cape Bon area. Any prolonged battle risked leaving them without enough fuel to return, forcing a ditching in the Mediterranean. Allied intelligence, informed by ultra-decrypt, was fully aware of this weakness and intended to exploit it without hesitation. Meanwhile, the 57th Fighter Group had been preparing for just such an opportunity. Stationed at LGM in Tunisia, its pilots had spent weeks rehearsing how to break up and destroy large transport formations. For this operation, the entire group was committed, reinforced by the 314th Fighter Squadron from the 324th Fighter Group, bringing the American total to 47 P-40 Warhawks. Higher above, 12 Spitfires of No. 92 Squadron RAF were positioned to guard the upper airspace. Though not the most cutting-edge U.S. fighter, the P-40 had been carefully adapted for the Mediterranean theater. Improved supercharger arrangements gave it stronger performance at median altitude, and its 6.50 caliber machine guns were precisely harmonized to converge at roughly 250 yards, an ideal distance for tearing apart unarmored transports. At approximately 1500 hours, observers spotted the German formation heading northeast towards Sicily, skimming dangerously low over the sea. Accounts differ, placing their altitude anywhere between 50 and 1,000 feet. The U-52s maintained tight V-shaped clusters, a pattern that had previously served them well in warding off focused fighter attacks. But on this day, that same arrangement would render them painfully vulnerable. The Allied fighters had maneuvered into an almost textbook ambush position. The P-40s descended from about 4,000 feet while the Spitfires watched from 15,000. With the sun setting behind the Allied formation, the attackers were nearly invisible. The Germans, flying close to the reflective surface of the sea, appeared stark and unmistakable against the water. When the Allied squadrons committed to the attack, the German escort was confronted with an unwinnable dilemma. Climbing to meet the threat meant burning the small reserve of fuel they desperately needed for the return flight, and it also meant leaving the slow transports exposed. Remaining at low level, however, surrendered altitude and initiative to the Americans. The escort leader ultimately ordered a climb to challenge the attackers, a decision that reflected both courage and grim necessity, though it changed nothing about the outcome. What followed resembled a deliberate destruction rather than a conventional dogfight. The P-40 struck the transport stream in a series of coordinated dives, each pilot selecting a target and firing with measured accuracy. The U-52's defensive guns, typically a single 13mm weapon in an overhead mount and a pair of 7.92mm guns firing from side windows, were hopelessly outmatched by the concentrated fire of the American heavy machine guns. Allied pilots later recalled seeing German personnel inside the transports attempting to shoot back with whatever they had: service rifles, sidearms, even small machine pistols fired blindly through cabin openings. The defenders of the transport group put up a determined fight, but their efforts had little effect against Allied fighters diving through the formation at high velocity. The G-52 transports, built with lightweight aluminum plating intended for range rather than durability, offered virtually no resistance against streams of .50 caliber fire. The German escort units attempted to shield the formation, yet they quickly found themselves outmatched, both numerically and tactically. Spitfire squadrons struck from higher altitude, drawing the attention of the escorts, while the P-40s remained free to tear into the vulnerable transports below. German pilots later recounted the helplessness of the situation. While they struggled to stay alive under the pressure of superior Allied numbers, they were forced to watch the very aircraft they were assigned to protect being destroyed one after another. In a matter of moments, the stretch of sea beneath the battle was dotted with blazing debris. Several transports disintegrated in the air. Others plunged into the water in pieces, and some attempted desperate crash landings along the Sicilian shoreline. German post-operation summaries reported that 24 transports were completely lost and another 35 sustained damage, many so badly that they were never again returned to service. The official casualty logs recorded the immediate losses among flight crews: 20 dead, 28 injured, and 50 listed as missing. These figures, however, almost certainly referred only to aviation personnel. The transports had been carrying far more than pilots and mechanics. On board were administrative staff, medical teams accompanying wounded soldiers, ground specialists, and technicians whose technical knowledge was essential to Luftwaffe operations. The destruction of each transport thus represented more than the loss of an airframe. It meant the removal of personnel whose skills sustained the broader German war effort. These were not frontline fighters, but the individuals who kept aircraft flying, maintained communications networks, and provided medical evacuation. Their absence weakened the Luftwaffe just as significantly as the loss of experienced combat units. American losses were minimal by comparison: 6 P-40s and a single Spitfire, along with the deaths or capture of their pilots. The imbalance in casualties, amounting to a confirmed kill ratio of at least 4-to-1 and potentially approaching 10-to-1 depending on the precise accounting, made clear the extent of Allied tactical dominance during the engagement. Declassified records later highlighted the decisive contribution of ultra-intelligence to what became known as the Palm Sunday Massacre. Allied cryptanalysts had decrypted German communications days before the operation. They possessed detailed knowledge of the transport mission, including the number of aircraft, the flight path, the strength of the escort, and even the nature of the cargo. This information allowed commanders to place fighter groups in exactly the right positions at the right time. Pilots were already at altitude. Fuel requirements were calculated precisely for sustained engagement, and ammunition belts containing armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds were arranged specifically for maximizing damage to transport aircraft. The Germans never realized their encrypted traffic had been compromised. Post-war interrogations revealed that Luftwaffe officers believed the interception had resulted from chance, reconnaissance from the coastline, or simple misfortune. The possibility that Enigma had been penetrated did not cross their minds, leaving the Allies free to benefit from the intelligence windfall for the remainder of the conflict. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Rome, the first reports of the catastrophe were initially dismissed. Senior officers assumed the figures were exaggerated or that the chaos of battle had led to misreporting. Only after repeated confirmations did the scale of the losses become undeniable. Confirmation of the scale of the disaster came from a variety of sources: surviving crew members, Italian observers, and German naval units recovering those left in the water. The magnitude of the losses became impossible to ignore. In response, General Feldmarschall Albert Kessler, who commanded German forces in the Mediterranean, immediately ordered the suspension of all daylight transport flights. His war diary entry for April 18th simply noted the new reality. Daytime resupply missions were no longer feasible, and only night operations could continue until further notice. Hitler's reaction was extreme, though predictable. He demanded that escort commanders face court-martial, publicly condemned transport pilots for alleged cowardice, and called for an immediate increase in fighter coverage in the Mediterranean. In practice, these orders were unrealistic, as German forces were already stretched thin across multiple fronts. The Palm Sunday air disaster effectively brought an end to German daytime air resupply in Tunisia. When combined with the Allied disruption of sea-based supply routes, it effectively severed the Axis logistical lifeline in North Africa at a critical juncture. Units that had previously managed to hold their defensive positions despite severe shortages now confronted the prospect of total logistical collapse. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commander of Army Group Africa, understood the implications at once. Without regular aerial resupply, his forces could maintain their positions for only a few weeks at most. The surrender of Axis troops in North Africa on May 13, 1943, less than a month after the Palm Sunday catastrophe, was directly hastened by the disruption of transport operations. The incident also had profound psychological and technological consequences. Palm Sunday clearly demonstrated American dominance in the Mediterranean skies. German units, previously reliant on Luftwaffe support for nearly every maneuver, were now forced to operate without any air cover. This shift struck a significant blow to morale across the German formations. Furthermore, the episode exposed technological gaps that astonished German observers. The P-40 Warhawk, dismissed by German intelligence as outdated, displayed performance far exceeding expectations. Modified engines allowed the aircraft to operate at altitudes the Germans had considered unattainable for this type. Gun sights delivered precision that, according to German reports, seemed almost impossibly accurate. Equally important, American radio communications functioned reliably. Each P-40 pilot maintained clear contact with fellow pilots and formation leaders, enabling coordinated attacks that were effectively impossible for German units, which suffered from frequent radio malfunctions. This fundamental technological edge, consistent and dependable communication, translated immediately into battlefield superiority and ensured that American air operations dominated the contested Mediterranean theater. American logistical organization and aircraft maintenance proved far more efficient than their German counterparts. P-40s operating in the Cape Bon sector maintained remarkably high readiness levels, even in the harsh desert environment. Spare parts were readily available, fuel supplies were consistent, and ammunition was never in short supply. German forces, in contrast, were hampered by chronic deficiencies across the board, from fuel to equipment. Perhaps the most critical advantage lay in the training of the pilots. The Americans who took part in the Palm Sunday operation had accumulated an average of over 300 flight hours prior to deployment. Their preparation included extensive practice in formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and combat maneuvers, all conducted safely within U.S. airspace. By the time they arrived in the combat theater, they were already highly skilled in operating their aircraft. German pilots, conversely, were increasingly products of a truncated training system. Chronic fuel shortages restricted flight time, instructors were reassigned to active combat units, and even training aircraft were redirected to operational roles. The rigorous pilot preparation that had once made the Luftwaffe formidable had largely disintegrated under the strain of a multi-front war. This imbalance only grew more severe as the conflict progressed. By late 1943, American aviators averaged 400 training hours, while Germans managed a mere 80. The events of Palm Sunday were not anomalous. They foreshadowed the systematic attrition the Luftwaffe would endure. Palm Sunday must be understood within the larger context of Operation Flax, a concerted Allied campaign to decimate Axis transport capacity in the Mediterranean. Prior to April 14, Allied fighters had already destroyed 14 U-52 transports and inflicted damage on several others. On April 10, another sweep eliminated an additional 20 transports. Following Palm Sunday, on April 19, South African Air Force squadrons downed 16 Italian SM-82 aircraft,
The apex of these operations occurred on April 22nd, when Allied fighters intercepted a formation of colossal 6-engine Me-323 Gigant transports, the largest aircraft operating in the Mediterranean theater. 14 of the 16 Gigants were destroyed, each carrying roughly 12 tons of critical fuel supplies. Of the 138 personnel on board, only 19 survived. In total, over 100 German transport aircraft were lost in less than 3 weeks. These losses devastated the Luftwaffe's capacity to sustain aerial supply operations, not just regionally, but across multiple theaters. The transport fleet never regained its former operational strength following Operation Flax. While the material losses were crippling, the destruction of experienced crews was even more consequential. Each Ju-52 typically carried a pilot with hundreds or even thousands of flight hours, along with a co-pilot and a radio operator gunner. Replacing this level of expertise was impossible in the short term. The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was severe. Transport crews who had once flown with relative freedom now faced missions that were effectively death traps. Fighter pilots understood they could not provide reliable protection, and ground forces could no longer rely on predictable aerial resupply. The events of Palm Sunday therefore represented more than a single operational failure. They marked a turning point in the Luftwaffe's strategic and operational capability, revealing vulnerabilities that the Allies would continue to exploit for the remainder of the conflict.
The events of Palm Sunday forced a stark reassessment within the German High Command regarding the state of the air war. The Luftwaffe's inability to shield its transport aircraft during daylight operations raised a critical question. If such basic protective measures were failing, how could German cities possibly withstand the impending Allied bombing campaigns? The catastrophic losses over Cape Bon foreshadowed the scale of destruction that Germany itself would eventually face. For American forces, the events of that day confirmed the effectiveness of their strategic approach. Meticulous training, advanced technology, and robust industrial support had culminated in a force capable of dominating the battlefield. Young American airmen, products of a society the Nazis had long dismissed as soft or inexperienced, had demonstrated a level of precision and lethality that silenced any doubts about their capabilities. The 57th Fighter Group earned a Distinguished Unit citation for their role in the engagement, and several pilots achieved A status in a single operation. Beyond formal accolades, the Palm Sunday action instilled enduring confidence among American aviators, reinforcing the effectiveness of their combat doctrine. Unlike approaches that glorified individual heroism, American training emphasized collective discipline, coordinated fire, and mission completion. This methodical, team-focused philosophy, occasionally criticized for lacking warrior spirit, proved devastatingly efficient in practice. Both sides leveraged the encounter for propaganda, though with sharply contrasting results. American newsreels highlighted dramatic gun camera footage of German transports erupting in flames, accompanied by playful titles such as Easter Egg Hunt over Tunisia and Luftwaffe's Black Sunday. Despite the sanitized presentation, these reels conveyed unmistakable air superiority. German propaganda, by contrast, struggled to provide credible explanations. Initial denials collapsed under scrutiny from neutral observers who confirmed the scale of the losses. Attempts to attribute the disaster to Italian sabotage or mechanical issues were undermined by eyewitness accounts from survivors. Eventually, the narrative shifted to frame the catastrophe as an act of heroic sacrifice, portraying transport crews as willingly perishing to support encircled forces. Within the Wehrmacht, however, the true nature of the defeat became quickly apparent. Soldiers circulated grim jokes about Luftwaffe Easter eggs that shattered at the slightest impact, and mocking songs about German intelligence gained popularity. The carefully cultivated image of Luftwaffe invincibility, reinforced since the Spanish Civil War, was shattered over Cape Bon. The repercussions of the Palm Sunday Massacre extended well beyond the immediate loss of aircraft. Hitler, stunned by the scale of the defeat, redirected fighter units from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean theater, inadvertently weakening German forces prior to the pivotal Battle of Kursk. Encouraged by their success, American planners accelerated preparations for the invasion of Sicily and intensified daylight bombing campaigns targeting Germany. Within German officer circles, the battle became a cautionary case study in the dangers of underestimating American military potential. Officers who had previously dismissed U.S. forces as amateurish were compelled to acknowledge that American industrial and organizational capacity had produced a combat force of remarkable effectiveness. The massacre influenced some German officers who would later take part in resistance efforts against Hitler, reinforcing the perception that the war's outcome might be beyond Germany's control. The demonstration of American superiority in the Mediterranean raised a critical strategic concern. If the United States could exert such dominance in North Africa, what would be possible once their full strength was deployed in Europe? Historians of aerial warfare regard the Palm Sunday Massacre as one of the most lopsided air engagements of World War II. While precise figures remain debated, German records indicate the destruction of 24 Ju-52 transports and damage to an additional 35, whereas American accounts claimed up to 70 losses. The event's tactical and strategic significance is indisputable, and it illustrated several enduring principles of air combat. Intelligence superiority enables operational surprise. Technological advantages must be leveraged systematically. High-quality training outweighs combat experience alone. Coordinated operations surpass individual skill, and industrial capability directly translates into sustained combat power. Historians of aerial warfare regard the Palm Sunday Massacre as one of the most lopsided air engagements of World War II. While precise figures remain debated, German records indicate the destruction of 24 Ju-52 transports and damage to an additional 35, whereas American accounts claimed up to 70 losses. The event's tactical and strategic significance is indisputable, and it illustrated several enduring principles of air combat. Intelligence superiority enables operational surprise. Technological advantages must be leveraged systematically. High-quality training outweighs combat experience alone. Coordinated operations surpass individual skill, and industrial capability directly translates into sustained combat power. Modern military strategists often examine the events of Palm Sunday as a paradigmatic case of highly effective interdiction. The operation demonstrated how superior intelligence, meticulous planning, and precise execution can cripple an adversary's logistical capabilities. This incident continues to serve as a benchmark for contemporary air campaigns, highlighting the profound impact that targeted strikes on transport infrastructure can have on the broader war effort. The Palm Sunday attack also provokes challenging reflections on the ethical and emotional dimensions of modern combat. The German transport aircraft targeted were undoubtedly legitimate military assets, ferrying critical supplies to frontline units. Yet these planes were densely occupied by human beings, including non-combatants, such as medical staff, clerical personnel, and other support members, who perished in the strikes. American pilots involved in the operation experienced a mixture of professional satisfaction and moral unease. They had accomplished their objectives with remarkable efficiency, yet the engagement's one-sided nature, striking largely defenseless transports, lacked the perceived honor associated with direct aerial duels between fighters. These conflicting feelings illustrate the broader shift in warfare, from individualized heroism to large-scale mechanized destruction. The operation exemplified a type of warfare characterized by precision, discipline, and industrial-scale lethality. The Americans executed the mission without malice, driven by duty and operational goals rather than revenge or personal glory. Their effectiveness rested on careful preparation, technological advantage, and systematic application of force, all hallmarks of modern air power. Several enduring lessons emerge from Palm Sunday. First, mastery of intelligence can produce victories far beyond the scale of the forces directly engaged. Second, once air superiority is established, an attacker can methodically dismantle an enemy's logistical network, striking at the very lifeblood of military operations. Third, industrial capacity, comprehensive training systems, and organizational resilience are decisive factors in protracted conflicts.
Moreover, the engagement underscored the extreme vulnerability of air transport missions without protective dominance in the skies, prompting militaries worldwide to invest heavily in defensive systems for cargo aircraft and to prioritize control of the air before undertaking major logistical operations.
The Palm Sunday encounter also demonstrated how rapidly air dominance can shift. The Luftwaffe, which had enjoyed near-complete control over European airspace from 1939 through 1941, suddenly found itself powerless over Cape Bon in 1943. This episode underlined a critical principle. Battlefield advantages are transient, and continual innovation and adaptation are vital for sustaining military effectiveness. Though the massacre itself unfolded in roughly 15 minutes, its repercussions resonated across the remainder of the war. In that brief window over Cape Bon, American pilots not only destroyed numerous German aircraft, they showcased the emergence of a new era in aerial combat. For the Germans, the speed and scale of the losses were shocking, marking more than a tactical setback. It was a stark revelation of a shifting strategic paradigm. Industrialized democracies, when fully mobilized and strategically directed, could generate combat power that surpassed the capabilities of even highly experienced, ideologically motivated forces. The Palm Sunday Massacre highlighted the decisive advantage conferred by technological superiority, rigorous training, and industrial strength, proving that these factors could outweigh individual skill, battlefield experience, and doctrinal fervor. In essence, American forces had transformed war into a systematic science, demonstrating that meticulous preparation and mechanized efficiency could eclipse the traditional warrior ethos that had fueled German victories in the early stages of the conflict. This episode remains a defining example of how modern air power reshapes the conduct, ethics, and outcomes of war. The Palm Sunday engagement marked a turning point in the history of aerial combat. On the afternoon of April 18, 1943, within a remarkably brief window of roughly 15 minutes, American fighter aircraft inflicted catastrophic losses on German forces, destroying or severely damaging between 59 and 70 planes. While precise figures vary, the psychological consequences of the encounter far outweighed the statistical ones. The Luftwaffe's ability to move troops and supplies across the Mediterranean was effectively crippled, directly weakening Axis operations in North Africa. More importantly, the battle highlighted the practical strengths of American military doctrine. It reflected a methodical approach to preparation, reliance on advanced technology, integration of intelligence into operational planning, and the industrial infrastructure necessary to sustain prolonged conflict. What emerged was not merely a tactical victory, but a demonstration that the U.S. could translate these elements into decisive battlefield dominance. Young American pilots, often underestimated by Nazi propaganda as products of a soft democracy, proved to be highly capable and deadly combatants. The German forces, shocked by the scale of their losses, faced more than immediate defeat. They were witnessing the emergence of a new paradigm of military power that would shape both the remainder of World War II and the post-war world order.
For military analysts, the events of Palm Sunday remain an essential case study. The battle illustrated how superior intelligence can create tactical surprise, how technological advantages can be exploited effectively, and how rigorous training and sustained industrial output combine to produce overwhelming combat efficiency. Transport crews, departing from Tunisia that afternoon, anticipated routine missions to Sicily, and their fighter escorts, seasoned veterans of previous encounters, expected to provide seamless protection. In a matter of minutes, those expectations were annihilated, along with the aircraft themselves. The outcome demonstrated that American forces were capable of applying air power with unprecedented precision and coordination. The brief duration of the engagement, approximately a quarter of an hour, belied its long-term significance. It signaled the decline of the romanticized concept of individual heroism in the air and heralded an era in which systematic, technologically driven air operations would dominate. German forces, unable to comprehend the scale of their losses, were witnessing the advent of American air supremacy, which would soon become a defining feature of modern warfare. Palm Sunday underscored a fundamental principle of contemporary combat. Success depends less on individual courage and more on the ability to integrate intelligence, technology, training, and industrial strength into a coherent and overpowering fighting force. Over the azure expanse of the Mediterranean, American pilots exemplified this principle with remarkable clarity. While disbelief among German ranks was widespread, the reality of destruction and loss was indisputable, and the trajectory of the conflict became increasingly clear. The impact of that day resonates well beyond the immediate tactical sphere. Military organizations around the world continued to study the engagement, extracting lessons about the necessity of air superiority, the vulnerability of transport operations, and the decisive role of intelligence in modern operations. Palm Sunday was more than a tactical encounter. It was a practical demonstration of how aerial warfare, and indeed modern warfare as a whole, would be waged and won in the decades to follow.